So here is something personal I have never really talked about in one of these conversations before. My grandfather was a cattle rancher in central Montana, fifth generation on the same land, and I spent every summer of my childhood on that ranch. I can still smell the hay in the barn. I can still hear the sound of cattle moving across a pasture at dawn, and I can still feel the calluses on my grandfather's hands when he would shake mine and tell me that this land was our family's legacy. That ranch is gone now, sold off in 2014 because the economics just did not work anymore, and my grandfather never really recovered from it. He passed 2 years later, and my mother will tell you the heartbreak killed him faster than anything else could have. So when someone in a lab coat in San Francisco tells me they are going to grow meat in a steel tank, and that this is the future and my grandfather's way of life was just an inefficient relic of the past, I have a reaction to that. And I want to be honest about it upfront because I think a lot of people have that same reaction, and it does not get taken seriously enough.
And I respect that deeply, and I am not going to pretend that I have the same personal connection to ranching because I do not. But I want to tell you a different story, one that I think your grandfather might have actually understood. In the 1890s, the streets of New York City were drowning in horse manure, literally tens of thousands of horses producing millions of pounds of waste. And there were serious people, smart people, who predicted that cities would become uninhabitable within decades because there was simply no way to manage that much manure. And then the automobile came along and the entire problem evaporated, not because anyone solved the horse manure crisis, but because the underlying technology shifted so completely that the crisis became irrelevant. I am not saying your grandfather's life was horse manure, please hear me on that. But I am saying that sometimes the most respectful thing we can do for a tradition is to recognize when the world has changed in ways that demand a new approach, and clinging to the old way out of love can sometimes cause more harm than letting go.
That is a nice analogy, but the automobile actually worked. It actually replaced horses. It did what people said it would do, roughly when they said it would do it. And I think that is where the lab-grown meat story starts to fall apart for me, because the promises have been extraordinary and the delivery has been, let us say, underwhelming. But we will get to that.
We will, and I think you might be surprised by some of what I have to say about the promises, because I am not as starry-eyed about this as you might expect.
All right, so let us talk about why this conversation is happening at all. Because nobody would care about growing meat in a lab if there were not a climate argument behind it. And the climate argument is real. I will give you that upfront. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization puts livestock at around 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is roughly the same as the entire global transportation sector, every car, truck, ship, and airplane on the planet. That is a staggering number. And it is driven by methane from cattle digestion, nitrous oxide from manure, the carbon cost of growing feed crops, and the deforestation that happens to create new pastureland, especially in places like the Brazilian Amazon. I am not denying any of that. Where I start to get skeptical is when the lab-grown meat advocates throw out numbers like 92% fewer emissions, because that number comes from life cycle analyses that are based on projections about a production process that does not yet exist at any meaningful scale. And projections about future technology are worth about as much as the paper they are printed on.
So the 92% number does come with significant caveats, and you are right to flag that it is based on projected production rather than current reality. But here's what I think is harder to argue with. Even if the actual reduction turns out to be 60% or 50% or even 40%, that is still an enormous amount of greenhouse gas that does not enter the atmosphere. And the reason the projections are so favorable is not magic. It is basic thermodynamics. A cow is an incredibly inefficient machine for converting plant calories into meat calories. You need something like 25 calories of feed to produce 1 calorie of beef. And during that process, the animal is breathing, moving, generating heat, fighting off disease, and producing methane as a byproduct of digestion. A bioreactor does not do any of those things. Takes cells and feeds them directly, with no skeletal system to build, no immune system to maintain, no digestive tract to power. The fundamental physics of it suggests that cultivated meat should be dramatically more efficient, And the question is really about how much of that theoretical advantage survives contact with real-world manufacturing.
And I would add that the climate math has another side to it that the Silicon Valley pitch decks never mention, which is regenerative agriculture. There are ranchers right now today who are using managed grazing practices that actually sequester carbon in the soil, that rebuild grassland ecosystems, that increase biodiversity. Alan Savory has been making this case for decades, and while his specific claims are debated, the broader principle that well-managed grazing can be part of the climate solution rather than just the climate problem is gaining real scientific support. So when people present this as a binary choice between factory farming and lab meat, they are erasing an entire category of innovation that keeps human beings connected to the land and to their food in ways that I think matter for reasons that go beyond carbon accounting.
Regenerative agriculture is beautiful, and I genuinely support it. But I need to be honest about the math. Global meat consumption is not falling. It is rising sharply, especially in developing economies where a growing middle class wants the diet that wealthy countries have enjoyed for decades. We are headed toward a world that needs to produce dramatically more meat than we produce today, and there is simply not enough land on this planet to do that regeneratively. The numbers do not work. Regenerative grazing requires more land per animal, not less, and we are already using roughly 30% of the Earth's ice-free land surface for livestock. So yes, regenerative agriculture should be part of the picture, absolutely. But it cannot be the whole picture unless you are willing to tell billions of people in the developing world that they do not get to eat the way Americans eat, and I am not comfortable with that argument.
Okay, so now let us talk about promises, because this is where I really get fired up. The first lab-grown burger was produced in 2013 by Mark Post at Maastricht University, and it cost $330,000 to make a single patty. And I remember the coverage at the time. It was breathless. It was revolutionary. And the prediction was that within 5 to 7 years, we would see cost parity with conventional meat and widespread commercial availability by the early 20s. Well, it is now well past those deadlines, and we are nowhere close. The companies that raised billions of dollars in venture capital have largely failed to scale. Some have gone bankrupt, and the ones that are still operating are producing tiny quantities at prices that are still many multiples of conventional meat. So I have heard this song before. We were told autonomous cars would be everywhere by 2020. We were told fusion power was always 20 years away. And I have to tell you, the pattern of a flashy demo followed by bold predictions followed by quiet failure is very familiar. And it makes me deeply skeptical of anyone who says this time is different.
And you are right to be skeptical, because the timelines were absurd and the industry overpromised in ways that have damaged its own credibility, and I am genuinely frustrated by that. But I want to offer you a different comparison because I think it is more instructive than the autonomous car one. Solar panels. In 1977, solar electricity cost $76 per watt. People said it would never be competitive with fossil fuels, that it was a plaything for rich environmentalists, that the economics would never work. And for decades they were right. The cost came down slowly, the efficiency was terrible, and the promises of solar advocates consistently ran ahead of reality. And then the learning curve kicked in, manufacturing scaled, and the cost fell off a cliff. Today solar is the cheapest source of new electricity in most of the world. Cheaper than coal, cheaper than gas. And the people who said it would never work look foolish in hindsight. I am not guaranteeing that lab-grown meat follows the same curve, but I am saying that dismissing a technology because its first decade was expensive and slow would have been a catastrophic mistake with solar, and it might be a catastrophic mistake here.
But for every solar panel success story, there is a Theranos and a WeWork. The venture capital world is full of companies that raised billions on the promise of revolutionary technology, that had charismatic founders and dazzling pitch decks and breathtaking projections, and that turned out to be selling a fantasy. How do I tell the difference between the lab-grown meat company that is going to be solar panels and the one that is going to be Theranos? Because from where I am sitting, the pitch sounds remarkably similar. Trust us. The technology is almost there. We just need more funding. The breakthrough is right around the corner. And meanwhile, the technical challenges are genuinely daunting. Growing animal cells at scale requires bioreactors that maintain perfect sterility over long production runs. And anyone who has worked in biopharma will tell you that contamination is a constant battle that drives costs through the roof. These cells need growth media that used to require fetal bovine serum, which is both expensive and kind of defeats the purpose of avoiding animal agriculture. And while serum-free alternatives exist, they add their own cost and complexity.
You are absolutely right about the technical challenges, and I want to acknowledge something that I think the industry has been reluctant to admit, which is that growing meat in a bioreactor is fundamentally a biomanufacturing problem, and biomanufacturing is hard. It is really, really hard. But here is something interesting that does not get talked about enough. The sterility challenge in a bioreactor, while real, is actually a cleaner problem than what happens in conventional meat processing. The CDC estimates that roughly 48 million Americans get foodborne illness every year, and a significant portion of that comes from bacterial contamination in slaughterhouses and processing plants. E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, these are constant problems in conventional meat production, and they kill hundreds of people every year. A bioreactor environment, precisely because it demands sterility, actually eliminates the entire category of fecal contamination that plagues the conventional supply chain. So yes, sterility is expensive, but it also produces a fundamentally safer product, and that trade-off is worth taking seriously.
Let me tell you what I see when I drive through rural Montana or Kansas or Texas, because I think the people in this conversation who are usually loudest about lab-grown meat have never spent meaningful time in those communities. Family farms and ranches are dying, and they have been dying for decades, squeezed between rising input costs and stagnant commodity prices, and the relentless consolidation of the meatpacking industry that leaves them with fewer and fewer buyers for their cattle. These are people who are already hanging on by their fingernails, who are already watching their children leave for cities, because there is no economic future on the land. And now, you want to tell them that the product they have spent their whole lives producing is going to be replaced by something grown in a factory by people with PhDs. I understand why that feels like an attack, because in a very real sense it is. It is the final chapter in a story of displacement that has been unfolding for generations, and pretending otherwise is dishonest.
And I hear you, and I want to push back gently on one thing, because I think the framing of lab-grown meat as the thing that will kill family farming misses a really important truth. Family farming is already being killed right now today by the existing industrial agriculture system. The big four meatpackers control over 80% of the beef market, and they squeeze family ranchers on price while keeping consumer prices high. And the family rancher gets absolutely crushed in that dynamic. Your grandfather did not lose his ranch because of lab-grown meat. He lost it because the economics of industrial commodity agriculture are brutally hostile to small operators. So when I look at cultivated meat, I actually see a potential disruption of that consolidated power structure, because you do not need 100,000 acres and a relationship with Tyson to operate a bioreactor. The technology could, in theory, enable smaller, more distributed production that breaks the stranglehold of the meatpacking oligopoly, though I admit that is a hopeful reading of how it might unfold rather than a certain one.
That is a hopeful reading, and I appreciate you flagging it as such. But the history of technology disruption suggests that new industries tend to consolidate just as aggressively as old ones. Look at tech, look at pharma, look at any capital-intensive industry where the barriers to entry are high. The idea that bioreactors are going to be operated by small family businesses instead of by the same massive corporations that already control the food supply strikes me as naive. And there is something else I want to name, which is the cultural dimension. Food is not just fuel, it is identity, it is tradition, it is community. A barbecue in Texas, a fish fry in Louisiana, a clam bake in New England. These are rituals that connect people to place and to each other, and they are built around a relationship with real animals raised on real land. I am not saying that is a sufficient reason to reject new technology, but I am saying that dismissing it as mere sentimentality misunderstands what food means to people.
And I would never dismiss it as sentimentality, because you are right that food carries cultural weight that goes far beyond nutrition. But I would also point out that what we consider traditional food has changed enormously even within living memory. Your grandfather's generation ate dramatically differently than his grandfather's generation, and the industrial feedlot that produces most American beef today would have been unrecognizable to a rancher in 1900. Traditions evolve, they always have, and the question is whether they evolve in ways that serve the values we actually care about, or whether we freeze them in place out of nostalgia for a version of the past that was already gone before we started this conversation. If what you value is connection to the land, stewardship of animals, community around shared meals, I think all of those things can survive and even thrive alongside cultivated meat. They just might look different than they did on your grandfather's ranch, and different is not the same as gone.
So here is where I come down, and it might surprise you because I am not actually opposed to the research continuing. I think cultivated meat is a fascinating scientific project that might one day produce something genuinely valuable. And I do not want to be the person who stands in the way of innovation because I am too attached to the past. But I think we need radical honesty about where this technology actually is, not where VC pitch decks say it will be. And I think we need to stop treating it as an excuse to ignore the changes we could be making right now with existing technology and existing practices. Invest in regenerative agriculture, break up the meatpacking monopolies, support family farmers with policies that actually help them rather than subsidizing the corporations that are destroying them. Do all of that today, and if lab-grown meat eventually delivers on its promises at scale, great. We can integrate it into a food system that is already healthier and more resilient. But betting the future of food on a technology that cannot yet feed a single city is a gamble I am not willing to take with the livelihoods of real communities.
And I think that is actually a more reasonable position than you probably realize, because I agree with almost everything you just said. The mistake the cultivated meat industry has made is positioning itself as a replacement for conventional agriculture rather than as an addition to a diversified food system. We need regenerative ranching and lab-grown meat and plant-based alternatives and better food policy and reformed subsidies. All of it simultaneously. Because the scale of the climate and food security challenge is so enormous that no single approach can solve it alone. Where I push back is on the timeline, because I think the urgency of the climate crisis means we cannot afford to wait for lab-grown meat to prove itself fully before investing heavily in its development. We need to be running multiple experiments at once, accepting that some will fail, and building the manufacturing infrastructure now so that when the technology does mature, we can scale it fast enough to actually matter. The planet is not going to wait for us to be comfortable.
I just hope that in the rush to build the future, we do not lose sight of the people who are living in the present. My grandfather spent his whole life caring for land and animals, and he did it with a kind of quiet dignity that I have never seen replicated in a laboratory or a boardroom. Whatever we build next, I want it to carry some of that forward, because a food system that is efficient but soulless is not actually an improvement. It is just a different kind of failure.
And I think the best way to honor your grandfather's legacy is to make sure that the next generation of people who care about food and land and animals has a viable future, whatever form that takes. Because the worst outcome is not that the food system changes, it is that it does not change fast enough, and the land your grandfather loved becomes uninhabitable because we were too sentimental to try something new. I would rather build something imperfect and keep improving it than preserve something beautiful and watch it burn. But I hear you, and I think this tension between honoring the past and building the future is the most honest place we can stand.